Hollywood's golden age, when the men were impossibly handsome, their suits perfectly pressed, and their hair, well, let's just say it never moved. Back then, leading men weren't just actors, they were icons. The rugged cowboy, the smooth spy, the charming romantic who could make any woman swoon with one smoldering glance. But behind those thick pompadours and polished curls, there was a secret, one of Hollywood's best-kept illusions. Many of the era's biggest stars were bald, and those perfect heads of hair, yeah, they came straight out of a stylist's box. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 20 Golden Age Hollywood stars who were secretly bald but wore wigs. And trust me, by the end, you'll never look at some of these legends the same way again. Cesar Romero, the Latin lover's covered crown. If charm had a face, it would have looked a lot like Cesar Romero. Tall, elegant, and effortlessly cool, Romero was Hollywood's original Latin lover. For decades, he danced through romantic comedies, westerns, and, of course, left his mark as the flamboyant Joker in the 1960s Batman TV series. And while that iconic green Joker hair became his signature, it wasn't really his. By his 30s, Romero's real hair had already started packing its bags and leaving the building. But instead of stressing, he leaned into Hollywood magic, investing in a collection of wigs that could have had their own agent. The man had one for every mood, slick and shiny for romance, wavy for drama, and bold for comedy. By the time he was clowning around as the Joker, that wig was practically acting alongside him. And honestly, it worked. Romero wasn't embarrassed about it either. He'd casually adjust his hair mid-scene or take it off during lunch breaks, like it was no big deal. Once, he even joked, "If I'm acting, why can't the hair act too?" That's confidence. Pure, effortless, old-school confidence. In a world obsessed with appearances, Cesar Romero proved you could keep your wig and your dignity, all while smiling through it. Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Hollywood royalty's hidden crown. Being the son of Douglas Fairbanks Sr., the king of swashbucklers came with expectations, and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. lived up to them. He was refined, suave, and impeccably dressed. But by his early 30s, the perfect gentleman had a not-so-perfect problem, a receding hairline. For Fairbanks Jr., though, a wig wasn't a secret. It was an accessory. Like cufflinks or a fine hat, it was simply part of the outfit. And he made sure every piece was custom-made, perfectly fitted, and styled for the moment. Whether he was on screen dueling with a sword or attending a royal banquet, his hairpiece never dared step out of line. Fairbanks didn't hide it or flaunt it. He simply wore it well. Because for him, style wasn't about pretending to be perfect, it was about carrying yourself like a gentleman. He treated his wigs with the same respect as his tuxedos, with care, class, and quiet confidence. Sean Connery, from Bond's perfect hair to embracing baldness, the name's Bond, James Bond, and yes, even 007 wore a wig. When Sean Connery first appeared in Dr. No in 1962, audiences were captivated by his suave demeanor, deep voice, and perfectly slicked-back hair. But little did anyone know, Connery was already going bald in his 20s. Producers decided that the world's most dangerous spy couldn't be balding, so they gave him a secret weapon, a handcrafted wig that could survive explosions, fistfights, and steamy love scenes. The wig became as important to Bond's image as the Aston Martin or the Martini. But by the 1970s, Connery made a move that few leading men had the courage to make. He ditched the wig completely, and instead of losing his appeal, he became more iconic. His bald head wasn't a flaw, it was power. In films like The Untouchables and The Hunt for Red October, Connery proved that real masculinity isn't about the hair. It's about the presence, the confidence, the charisma, and let's be honest, he made bald look cooler than any full head of hair ever could. Yul Brynner, the man who made baldness sexy. While most stars were clinging to their wigs, one man went the opposite way. Yul Brynner shaved his head completely in 1951 for his role as the King in The King and I. The moment he stepped on stage with that gleaming dome, audiences couldn't take their eyes off him. It was daring, bold, unforgettable. He'd still had hair at the time, thinning, but not gone. But after seeing how powerful his look was, he kept it that way for the rest of his life. In a world where baldness was a career killer, Brenner made it iconic. He turned his shaved head into a trademark, a symbol of power and confidence that no wig could compete with. Even when he had to wear hairpieces for certain movie roles, he did it without fuss. They were just props, part of the job. Yul Brynner didn't just change Hollywood's view of baldness, he redefined what it meant to be a leading man. Bob Hope, the comic who kept his topper tight. For more than 60 years, Bob Hope made America laugh. He hosted the Oscars, entertained troops overseas, and never missed a punchline. And through it all, his hair never seemed to move. That's because Bob Hope's legendary wit wasn't the only thing glued in place. His wig had been with him since the early 1940s. Hope's comedic style was full of energy, physical gags, dancing, and quick turns. So his hairpiece wasn't just a cosmetic choice. It was a stunt performer. It had to survive everything from pratfalls to chaotic dance numbers. And it did. Offstage, Hope wasn't afraid to joke about it. When entertaining soldiers, he'd sometimes pretend his hair was falling off, sending entire crowds into fits of laughter. But on television or at public events, that wig stayed perfectly in place, dignified, polished, and ready for showtime. Hope's secret hairpiece became part of his legend, proof that some jokes work best when the audience never sees the setup. Robert Taylor, the studio's polished perfection. Robert Taylor wasn't just a movie star, he was an MGM product. From his chiseled jawline to his gleaming hair, every detail was managed, marketed, and maintained by the studio. But behind the perfect image, MGM's stylists had a secret job, protecting Taylor's thinning hairline. They began supplementing his hair early, crafting wigs that evolved with each era. In the 1930s, they were smooth and debonair. By the 1950s, they had that rugged post-war look. Taylor himself didn't mind. To him, it was part of the craft, just another piece of costume and makeup. In Hollywood, after all, image was performance, and Taylor wore both with grace. Spencer Tracy, the natural actor's artificial hair. Spencer Tracy was the actor's actor. He didn't overact, he didn't fake it. He was it. Everything about him felt authentic, including his hair, or so people thought. By the early 1950s, even Tracy's famous everyman look needed some help. His wigs were subtle, realistic, and perfectly blended with his thinning hair. MGM made sure they aged with him so no one could pinpoint when he started wearing them. Privately, Tracy rarely appeared without it, except with Katharine Hepburn, his longtime companion. For him, it wasn't vanity, it was consistency, the same as hitting his marks or knowing his lines. Because if the audience noticed the hair, he wasn't doing his job. William Holden, the reluctant wig wearer. William Holden was Hollywood's golden boy, but his golden hair didn't last. By his early 30s, the shine was fading fast. When Sunset Boulevard reignited his career, Holden quietly began wearing wigs to maintain that leading man look. He never loved them. Friends said he'd often take them off between scenes just to breathe. But under the studio system, image was everything. And for a man known for intensity and masculinity, going bald wasn't an option. Ironically, his discomfort made him even more relatable. Audiences weren't watching his hair. They were watching the man beneath it. And that, perhaps, is what made Holden's performances unforgettable. Burt Lancaster, the action hero with anchored hair. Before becoming a Hollywood legend, Burt Lancaster was a circus acrobat. He could leap, swing, and perform stunts most men wouldn't dream of. But as his hairline retreated, his on-screen adventures presented a new challenge. How do you keep a wig in place while flipping through the air? Simple. You design it like military gear. Lancaster's wigs were secured with spirit gum, fine mesh, and secret anchors that held through sword fights and ocean wind. His team had it down to a science. He never complained or pretended. To him, it was just another prop. Even his pal Kirk Douglas used to tease him about it. Lancaster would grin and shoot back. "My fake hair looks better than yours anyway." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. Frank Sinatra, old blue eyes, and the perfect hairpiece. Frank Sinatra, the voice, the swagger, the tuxedo, the fedora, the stare that could melt a camera lens. Old Blue Eyes had everything, except, well, a full head of hair. By the mid-1950s, Sinatra's career had hit new highs, but his hairline had hit new lows. And while the rest of the Rat Pack joked and drank their way through fame, Sinatra's secret weapon was quietly glued to his scalp. Yes, Frank wore wigs. And not just any wigs. These were luxury pieces designed with precision and pride. He had different ones for every occasion, a slick, polished version for the stage, a natural, relaxed one for films, and an everyday topper for his off-duty charm. Among friends, the wigs were an open secret, often the subject of playful jabs. Dean Martin once cracked a joke about Sinatra's little helper. Sinatra didn't miss a beat. He sent his wig to Dean the next day in a box with a note that read, "Even I need a day off." That's classic Frank, confident enough to laugh at himself. But behind the humor was an obsessive perfectionist. His valet, George Jacobs, said Sinatra's pre-show hair ritual was military-level serious, steaming, brushing, positioning, and inspecting from every angle before he walked out under those bright Vegas lights. Because when Sinatra stepped onto that stage, there were no mistakes. Every strand, like every note, had to be perfect. And honestly, when you watched him perform, it didn't matter what was real or fake. Frank Sinatra was the performance, and the hair didn't wear him. He wore the hair. James Stewart, the everyman's quiet secret. Few stars captured the heart of America like James Stewart. He wasn't flashy or mysterious. He wasn't the kind of man who oozed movie star glamour. He was genuine, honest, the kind of guy you'd trust with your secrets. But even the most relatable man in Hollywood had one of his own. By the early 1950s, Stewart's hairline had started to fade. At first, he didn't bother hiding it. Audiences actually liked that he looked a little imperfect. But as he transitioned into more mature roles in films like Rear Window and Vertigo, Hollywood pressure crept in. So, Stewart started wearing subtle wigs. Not flashy ones, not Bond-style perfection. They were intentionally a bit messy, slightly uneven, real. His makeup artist once said that Stewart treated wigs like neckties, something you just put on before work. No drama, no vanity, just another tool for the job. And that was his magic. He didn't use the wig to look younger. He used it to look believable, because when you watched James Stewart, you didn't care about the hairline. You cared about the heart behind every line he spoke. Cary Grant, the perfect hair for the perfect man. If you could bottle the idea of movie star, it would look like Cary Grant. Polished, smooth, effortlessly elegant. Every time he appeared on screen, you believed you were watching the very definition of class. But even Cary Grant, Hollywood's dream man, had his own illusion to maintain. By his mid-30s, his famous hairline had started to thin. And for someone known as perfection personified, that just wasn't part of the script. So, Grant turned to some of the finest wig makers in Hollywood, the kind who worked with human hair, lace fronts, and custom dyes. Each piece cost thousands, hand-tied and tailored for every role. Grant didn't deny it. He treated wigs as part of his uniform. Just like his tailored suits and silk ties, they were an extension of his image. But unlike some stars who clung to their youthful look, Grant aged gracefully. As he got older, his hairpieces turned subtly gray, keeping his image believable, timeless, and refined. And when people asked how he always looked so perfect, he'd simply smile and say, "It takes a lot of effort to look this effortless." Cary Grant wasn't chasing youth. He was curating an illusion. And he did it so flawlessly that even now, decades later, the world still calls him the leading man. John Wayne, the Duke's hidden crown. John Wayne, the name alone still echoes with grit, courage, and cowboy swagger. He was the ultimate American hero, the man on horseback, hat tilted, squinting into the blazing desert sun. But by his late 30s, even the Duke was fighting a battle he couldn't win. His hairline. Wayne's wigs became part of his standard costume, rugged, slightly tousled, and built for the wild frontier. While Cary Grant's wigs were refined, John Wayne's had to survive dust storms. Literally. His crew had to engineer ways to keep the hair in place during gallops, gunfights, and all that desert wind. The solution? A hidden bandana under his hat, securing the wig like a stunt harness. Wayne didn't take it too seriously. He was known to toss the thing on a chair after long shoots and joke, "This damn thing's hotter than a tin roof in August." But when the cameras rolled, he always put it back on because it was part of the character. The Duke's hair was never about vanity. It was about image, that unshakable all-American hero who could ride through a sandstorm and never lose his cool, or his hairpiece. Fred Astaire, dancing with an invisible partner. No one in Hollywood ever moved quite like Fred Astaire. He floated across the screen like gravity didn't exist, gliding, spinning, and tapping in perfect rhythm. And somehow, through every breathtaking routine, his tuxedo stayed crisp. And his hair didn't move an inch. There's a reason for that. Fred Astaire had been balding since his late 20s, and his perfect hair was a technical marvel of its own. Working with Max Factor's team, he had wigs specially built for dance. Lightweight, breathable, glued tighter than his footwork was precise. They were designed to endure hours of motion and sweat under blazing stage lights. He even carried multiple identical copies on tour, just in case one ever failed him mid-spin. But guess what? It never did. Not once. Ginger Rogers, his most famous dance partner, once joked, "I learned early on never to run my fingers through Fred's hair. He'd never forgive me if I messed with his little friend." His little friend, of course, being the wig that never missed a step. Fred Astaire's hairpieces weren't about hiding insecurity. They were about maintaining illusion, because in his world, every detail mattered. He didn't just dance with partners, he danced with perfection, right down to every perfectly placed strand. Humphrey Bogart, the tough guy's secret vulnerability. Humphrey Bogart wasn't just a movie star, he was the movie star, the hard-boiled detective, the romantic anti-hero, the man who could say, "Here's looking at you, kid," and make it sound like poetry. But beneath that cool confidence, Bogart had a secret. His trademark slicked-back hair wasn't always his. By his early 30s, he was balding fast, and while the trench coat and fedora were part of the Bogart legend, the wig quietly completed the look. From the Maltese Falcon to Casablanca, every strand was carefully placed. Cinematographers even adjusted lighting to make sure no one ever noticed the transition between real and artificial hair. Off-screen, Bogart was surprisingly private about it. His wife, Lauren Bacall, once admitted that very few people ever saw him without the hairpiece, not even friends. The only time he'd take it off was to swim. And even then, no cameras were allowed. Bogart saw the wig as part of his armor, his cinematic uniform. It wasn't vanity, it was discipline, a symbol of the professionalism that made him Hollywood's most believable tough guy. Because to Bogart, illusion wasn't deceit, it was craft. Clark Gable, the king's hidden secret. When you think of classic Hollywood masculinity, one name always rises to the top: Clark Gable. The man who made, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," one of the most iconic lines in film history. The king of Hollywood. The man every guy wanted to be, and every woman wanted to be with. But even kings have secrets. By the time Gone with the Wind hit theaters in 1939, Gable was already wearing a partial wig. Decades of smoking, stress, and film makeup had taken a toll on his hairline, and MGM wasn't about to let their golden boy show weakness. Gable's hairpieces were masterful, thick, masculine, and slightly tousled to fit his rough-edged charm. Unlike the sleek precision of Cary Grant, Gable's wigs were built to look real, not perfect. He reportedly hated the process of applying them, but he understood the price of stardom. To be the king, you had to look like one. And yet, Gable's appeal went far deeper than the illusion. Wig or no wig, he carried himself with a swagger that no stylist could fake. That's why, even now, Clark Gable isn't remembered for what was on his head. He's remembered for what he brought to the screen. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler with a secret before Pirates of the Caribbean. There was Errol Flynn, the original Hollywood daredevil, charming, athletic, and irresistibly roguish. He could fence, ride, flirt, and fight with equal skill, all while looking like he'd just stepped out of a cologne ad. But Flynn's greatest illusion wasn't his swordplay, it was his hair. By his early 30s, his wild lifestyle, endless parties, booze, and stress started catching up with him. His thick, wavy mane began thinning fast. Hollywood stylists rushed to save the day. They created custom wigs that matched his signature adventurous look, slightly tousled, full of movement, and full of life. Flynn's wigs weren't just glued on, they were anchored, designed to stay in place during stunts, sword fights, and even underwater scenes. He didn't love them, but he knew they mattered. As one crew member recalled, he wore that wig like he wore his smile, perfectly, and without a hint of shame. Even off-camera, Flynn's charisma carried him. He didn't need to prove anything. He was Hollywood's ultimate rogue, wild, flawed, magnetic, and unforgettable. And his secret, it never stopped him from stealing the show or stealing hearts. Bing Crosby, the crooner's carefully styled crown. Before Sinatra, there was Bing Crosby, the smooth-voiced singer who defined an entire generation, crooning classics like White Christmas and charming his way through film after film. But as timeless as his voice was, his hair wasn't quite so lucky. By the early 1940s, Crosby was already balding heavily. Unlike others who opted for flashy wigs, Bing went for subtlety. His hairpieces were minimal, meant only to cover the thinning top, leaving the sides natural. Under studio lights, the illusion worked perfectly, and fans were none the wiser. It was just enough to keep that wholesome boy-next-door image alive. Crosby's wigs evolved with him over time. Simple, low-maintenance, practical. He wasn't chasing vanity. He was just keeping the focus where it belonged, on his voice, his charm, and his effortless cool. And that's the beauty of Bing Crosby's legacy. He didn't need a full head of hair to be unforgettable. All he needed was a song. Danny Kaye, the comedian with the disappearing hairline. Danny Kaye was one of the most talented performers Hollywood ever saw. A comedian, singer, dancer, and actor rolled into one. On stage, he was all energy. Facial expressions flying, limbs flailing, voice shifting from high to low in an instant. He was pure chaos and charisma, but behind that whirlwind of movement, there was a quieter insecurity, his receding hairline. Kaye's wigs were crafted to handle motion. They had to survive fast dancing, exaggerated gestures, and bright stage lights without slipping even an inch. His stylist worked miracles, keeping every piece perfectly in place as he bounded across sets. But what made Danny Kaye remarkable wasn't his illusion. It was his ability to own it. He didn't hide behind the wig. He performed through it. In interviews, he joked about being a walking special effect, always camera ready from head to toe. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. His hairpieces might have helped his image, but his humor, heart, and genius were all his own. Tony Curtis, the heartthrob who refused to age. By the 1950s, Tony Curtis had become the definition of Hollywood cool. Sharp jawline, slick hair, killer smile, and that unmistakable confidence that screamed movie star. But as the years went by, that famous jet black hair began fading fast. For Tony, whose looks had been central to his fame, baldness felt like an unwelcome guest. So he turned to one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets, high-end wigs. His hairpieces were made by master stylists in Beverly Hills, perfectly sculpted, shiny, and youthful. And boy, did they work. Even into his later years, Curtis looked every bit the charmer he'd been in Some Like It Hot. He didn't try to hide the truth from close friends. In fact, he often laughed about it, saying his hair cost more than some of his old cars. Curtis understood what many didn't. In Hollywood, presentation is performance. And if a great wig kept the magic alive, so be it. Because at the end of the day, fans didn't love his hair, they loved Tony Curtis. From cowboys to crooners, dancers to detectives, these 20 stars all had one thing in common. They lived under the brightest lights on Earth. And behind the scenes, they were human. Their wigs weren't just fashion, they were armor. They were illusion. They were a symbol of an era where image mattered just as much as talent. But look closer, and you'll see something deeper. Clark Gable's confidence, Sean Connery's boldness, Yul Brynner's defiance, James Stewart's sincerity, Cary Grant's elegance, Humphrey Bogart's strength. Each one found their own way to shine, hair or no hair. The golden age of Hollywood may have been built on fantasy, but it was powered by real people, flawed, brilliant, insecure, confident, and utterly unforgettable. So next time you watch one of those black and white classics and marvel at the perfectly styled curls, just remember, the real magic wasn't in the wig, it was in the men beneath it.